let's see, I've done research on violence for about 35 years, and this is the beginning of the end of my research on violence. I never thought I would say that day, because what I wanted to do is I wanted to understand violence from the points of view of perpetrators, and that's very difficult, because first of all, you have to get into their way of thinking, and that's very painful. And then once you get through all the pain and the emotion about it, then you have to start being analytic, and that's very difficult. And then even after you might have some understanding of it, then what do you do about it? And so the overall conclusion, finding is that actually violence is a mindless kind of activity, meaning that perpetrators think about the consequences for themselves and their short-term consequences, and they don't think about the consequences for other people in the short term or the long term, and they don't think about the consequences for themselves in the long term, because they all think they're going to get away with it, or they pretend that what they're doing is really okay, and that's how people are supposed to act.
And these, I'm going to give two quotes from perpetrators, and so they particularly address or illustrate the idea of a lack of awareness on their behavior and how it affects other people. And so the first example is Mike, who was a 32-year-old man who sexually abused his daughter and also raped his wife, repeatedly committed these offenses. So Jane interviewed him, and so to one of his responses to one of her questions, he says, rape, as a question, what's the big deal about rape? I rape my wife all the time. So with anybody I went with, if I couldn't control them, I didn't want any part of it. There was no saying no, I took it. So clearly, he's saying, what's the big deal about rape? That's a clear lack of awareness of not only his own behavior, but the effects it has on his wife and his daughter and whoever else he may come into contact with. Similarly, Jack, he was a sexual offender as well, and he began raping girls when he was in his mid-teens. And so he says, when I found out at about 16 that women could make me feel good through sex, that's all I wanted from them. The way I looked at it, when I forced them to have sex, it really didn't hurt them. They'll do this 1,000 times between now and the time they're dead. It's no big thing. So clearly, again, a clear lack of awareness of what he's doing and the effects it has on other people. This particular quote, I think it illustrates the potential for a mindfulness-based intervention. So this is Carl, and he physically abused his wife. He was a 22-year-old young man, physically abused his wife. And so this is a conversation during the interview with Jane that he made this comment. So he says, describing an argument that he and his wife were having, and he tried to pull himself away from the argument. He tried to manage himself. He says, I quieted down, but because of what she's saying, I ended up getting dragged back into the conversation because so far I haven't been able to just not argue with her. Anyway, that's when we started talking again. And that's when I cleared my throat, because when I talk about serious stuff, adrenaline and a lot of stuff is going on, so my throat gets dry. So this young man, he had not had any intervention or services, but he recognized his own bodily sensations. He ended up, in this particular incident, it ended up being a violent situation, and he did hit his wife. But what's lacking here, he recognized the bodily sensations, but he did not know how to manage them. And so that's a key thing in the intervention that Jane, we're going to talk about.